Hey there, this is Laura Williams, and I want to welcome you back to Encountering You. For those of you who don't know me or you are here for the first time, I'm a licensed professional counselor in Brentwood, Tennessee, which is right outside of Nashville. And together with my best friend, I co-own a group practice here called Be Found Counseling. My main goal in my profession is in dealing in complex trauma, which for most of you listening are going to think that's not me. In reality, it probably is, because when we think about complex trauma and we think about what contributes to it, it's actually repeated incidents of either abuse or neglect over time. And what I've learned in the work that I do is that most people actually have experienced that. Whether that's developmental in your childhood, whether it's through a relationship that you had in your childhood, in your family of origin, most of us come into adulthood with some form or some spectrum of complex PTSD. Okay. So today we are doing part 2 on codependence. So we're going to talk about where it comes from, what it costs you, and then we're going to talk a little bit about healing and the path back to yourself. So last time we talked about something that I think a lot of us carry, but we don't always have a name for it, right? And most of us kind of cringe, if I'm being honest, at the name, which is codependence. When we think about codependence, it's not that clinical extreme version that you're thinking about in your head. Okay. Like I can never do anything by myself. I remember when I first heard the word codependence, and this was probably when I was in my 20s, so a good 25 years ago. I know the word codependence, and it really kind of meant you couldn't do anything by yourself. Okay. So I always thought the opposite of codependence was independence, right? So once I got to adulthood and I thought, well, I'm pretty independent. I'm good. Okay. What I didn't realize is that actually codependence is a lot quieter than that. It looks very common, actually. The patterns that show up when we lose track of ourselves inside a relationship. Last time we talked about the 5 faces that it can take. We talked about the caretaker, right? Someone who's always showing up to help someone else. We talked about the peacekeeper, someone who might want to avoid conflict at all costs, right? So they don't really have an opinion about something. We talked about someone who might show up as a controller, okay? And this is often seen as a negative thing, but it really has to do with our sense of safety and our sense of what actually brings us peace inside. We talked about someone who acts like a chameleon. So someone who is one way on the inside, but on the outside can take the shape or take the color of everybody else in the room. And then we have the person who might leave before they're left. And this person generally feels really uncomfortable with closeness. It's never been safe to be in an intimate relationship, okay? Which again is often confusing to that person because we know we need connection and yet it feels really dangerous. So today we're actually going to go just a level deeper. We're going to look at where these patterns actually come from. We're going to look at what they cost us and, like I said earlier, what does it look like to move forward from this? So today is more of the personal half, right? We're not really naming things because we did that in the last episode. But what I want you to have is a little bit more understanding of how did I get here, right? Where did these patterns start? What were they protecting us from? Because remember, in the last episode, we talked about these adaptations as survival techniques. Okay, they actually weren't things that we just developed in childhood as normal responses to our normal daily activities. They were actually ways that we stayed safe and stayed in survival when we were growing up. Okay, so what does it actually cost us if we're still living like that? Because if I'm being honest, most of us don't need to actually continue living in these adaptations. They actually become our defaults rather than an intentional way of being. And so then what does healing really look like, right? And remember, and we've talked about this in previous episodes as well, healing, it's not a destination, but it is a direction. It's a way that we're moving forward in our lives. So as everything, we have to start at the beginning, right? Because none of these patterns just came here out of nowhere. They started somewhere. And usually it started quite a long time ago. And again, usually for a very good reason, right? So when I think about the healing our core issues model in childhood, we all share the same value that every child is born with a true nature. They have inherent worth. They have natural responses. They actually have their own experience. And that self gets shaped by the environment it's grown up in. If an environment is attuned and safe, which is rare, okay, the self will develop with some degree of wholeness. And so we'll make it into adulthood, knowing what we like, knowing our opinions on things, not feeling a bunch of shame, our openness to other people's opinions about things. And we will come to adulthood with a sense of self that isn't really rockable. But when it isn't, the self learns to adapt, might learn to hide, might learn to perform, or even disappear. Remember, when we're thinking about these things, this is not about blaming our parents. Most of our parents were well-meaning and they were doing their best within their own wounds. Because remember, our parents are wounded too, okay? So many times our families teach us things without actually meaning to. If you think back on your childhood, can you think of which emotions were allowed and which ones felt dangerous? I know in my family, my dad showed anger, right? That was allowed for my dad. But we were not. We were not allowed to show anger, okay? It was too much. I maybe saw my dad or my mom cry a handful of times, right? So what's the message there, right? Sadness is also not something that we want to feel. We also want to think about whether our needs matter, or are you an inconvenience? I tell this story a lot. And if you're a parent listening, okay, I always say, if you're a parent, try to listen to these as a child, right? So thinking about your experience growing up, not your experience of being a parent, because a lot of times what happens is we get flooded by shame because we've done something to our child, okay? And we can't even hear what's coming up next. So as I say this example, what I want you to hear is what was the experience like for you, not what is the experience of you as a parent, okay? So when we think about our needs mattering to our parents, this is a famous example. You get into a grocery store and the bathrooms are at the front, and you get all the way to the back of the grocery store and you have to go to the bathroom as a little kid. And what is the first thing your parent says to you? Most of us, why did you wait till we got to the back of the store? The bathrooms are all the way up front, okay? Now again, this is really, really common. So if you're a parent and you've done this, just notice it, right? And make the change. But what this teaches the child is I have to control when I go to the bathroom. I have to make sure I notice and think about it ahead of time. And I can't just have to go to the bathroom and have it be taken care of, right? So even that small example talks about what happens when our needs don't matter, all right? Now, again, most parents have a bajillion things going on in their minds, okay? So we know that this is not because a parent wants to be abusive or wants to be cruel. A lot of times this is just because our parent was overwhelmed, okay? So then we want to think about whether in our family of origin, if conflict led to resolution or if it led to catastrophe, all right? So a lot of times when we have conflict in our homes growing up, what we think about is not actually conflict. What we think about is fighting, okay? That is very different than conflict. Most people have a very big aversion to loud voices or to disagreement. And as humans, we have to learn to be able to do this, okay? But in our family of origin, if disagreement ended in people not speaking to each other, or if a disagreement ended in one person leaving, to a child, that can feel catastrophic, okay? If I have a conflict with my parent and I get sent to my room, that can feel catastrophic because what conflict tells us is that conflict leads to disconnection. And that actually it's something that no child wants to experience. Okay. So when you think about being a kid, I would think about, what did conflict look like in your home? Was it loud? Was it quiet? Did it end well? Or did it end in someone leaving or being upset? Okay. So now let's think about love, right? When you think about your experience in your family of origin, was love reliable, or was it something that you had to earn or something that you had to maintain? Most people will say, I knew my parents loved me. This is not what we're really talking about. Okay. I would say a majority of people probably had the experience that if they think back, they know their parents loved them. I can say that with 100% certainty. I know my mom loved me and I know my dad loved me. Okay. But the love that we're talking about, we can actually put the word connection on there. Okay. So if I think about love in this circumstance, what we're really talking about is, did I have to earn their approval? Did I have to maintain my relationship with them by not causing too much friction or by being someone they needed me to be? Okay. So when we think about earning love, that's kind of what we're talking about. So when you think back on that, that's kind of how I want you to be thinking about it. And then we want to think about what you were valued for. Okay. Were you valued for who you were or for what you do? This can look really small in relationships. Okay. If we think about our value, we might have gotten value from being the responsible one in our family. This is a really common theme that shows up with a lot of my clients. They'll come in and they'll say, well, my parents always thought I was so responsible. I was like a little adult. Okay. And that feels very valuable to you. Okay. But in actuality, no child should have to actually act like an adult before they are an adult. And so when we think about the things that we're valued for, what I want you to think about is, like, what did you have praise for? What were the things that you felt good about? Okay. So as we're going through these, we're also going to have to talk about our attachment connection. Again, when we go back to think about our family of origin, we always want to go back, because what our goal is with this is actually healing the wounds in their original form. Okay. We can throw a lot of positive messaging. We can throw some different tools at this. But what we're really doing is we're going back and we're working with the brain, right? So when we think about attachment, a child's primary attachment figures, if they're inconsistent, if they're unavailable, if they're scary, or if they're too connected, because we can have that too, right? And meshed, the child will adapt to whatever that is. Okay. So if we are growing up and we have anxious attachment, we are going to become hypervigilant to other people's moods and their needs. Okay. So these two, right? If we think about the categories we had from last time, we're talking about the caretaker and the peacekeeper. Okay. If I think about how I looked as a peacekeeper, because again, you can find yourself in more than one category. If I find myself in the peacekeeper category, if I was in a group of people and I noticed someone's nervous system kind of creeping up and feeling a little dysregulated, what I would do is kind of survey the room and see who I needed to be in order to help keep the nervous system back down. Right. So we might think about this person as like a regulator, right? They might say the peacekeeper, but it could be a regulator in the room. What do I need to say in order to make this kind of calm down? What do I need to do? Who do I need to be? Okay. That comes from an anxious attachment pattern. As soon as I feel someone else's anxiety raising up, I've got to bring that temperature down. Okay. Then we'll think about avoidant attachment. And in this attachment pattern, you kind of learn to need nothing. You don't really show anything, and you don't really depend on anyone. So this might look like the controller, right? Someone who has it all together, right? Or someone that wants everybody to do things a certain way. okay? Or the one who leaves, right? Because connection feels kind of dangerous. And then we have disorganized attachment. And this relationship is one in which it provides both, it's supposed to be the source of comfort, but it's actually also a source of fear. Okay. And so with that kind of relationship, it actually feels very confusing because I can do a lot of in and outs, right? And actually this might be like the chameleon. We can press in and act like we're having an intimate relationship, but we're really not. Somebody might feel like they know you, but they actually don't. Okay. Because this push and pull feels very normal and natural. Okay. Remember, attachment, when we think about it, it's not permanent. Thank goodness God made us with our brains to be malleable, right? Which means we can change our brains, but they are a template that our nervous system starts with. Okay. So codependence is an adaptation. It has to do with our attachment. It's the self learning to survive closeness when closeness isn't predictable and might feel a little unsafe. So let's talk about trauma just a little bit here. Now, when we think about trauma, there used to be like big T and little t. Okay. We don't really have that anymore. When we think about trauma, it's more like a spectrum. Okay. So kind of like codependence when I was talking about that last time. We can have trauma that looks like big overt abuse. We can have trauma that looks like neglect. Like I didn't get my needs met growing up. We can have trauma that looks really obvious, like loss or violence. Okay. But then we can also have trauma that looks a little quieter. It can look like chronic criticism growing up, never doing anything right. It can look like your parents being emotionally unavailable or emotionally immature. It can look like enmeshment, which can feel like closeness or connection, but it actually is too much. And we can be made to feel invisible. So those are actually quieter forms of trauma, but they are just as formative as the big major ones. Remember, you don't have to actually have a terrible childhood to carry these codependent patterns. Even good enough families pass on a lot of patterns that we might not need in adulthood, especially around emotions, around needs, and really around conflict. Our body holds the learning, okay? Regardless of how conscious or intentional it was, our bodies know. So that's why when I say these are adaptations and they're our default, it usually means that we're actually not choosing these patterns in adulthood. They've just become our way of being. And so we have to bring our unconscious things to our conscious, because that's the only way we can grow awareness and we can actually heal from them. So understanding where it came from is important, but I also want to name what it actually costs, right? Because there's a real price to living outside yourself, and it's worth looking at honestly. So what does it cost? In your body, you can feel like chronic tension. You're always monitoring, never fully resting. Even as I sit here, you all could probably observe this. As I talk, my shoulders kind of come up because I can honestly feel that in my body, right? Now, I don't feel anxious, but my body is telling me that something is going on, right? And so I have to consciously bring my shoulders back down, okay? Anxiety can also feel very free floating. You don't always know why it's there. You can't really name it and say, hey, I feel anxious because, but you might just be anxious. It might be exhaustion or fatigue that sleep doesn't fix. I know I've been in seasons of my life where I am doing all the right things. I'm going to bed at the right time. I'm waking up at the right time. I'm spending time with my journal. I'm exercising. But it just feels like I can't get that sleep that I need to feel not exhausted. Okay? Because the depletion is relational. It's not actually physical. And then many of you can experience resentment that just lives in your body. It might be a tight jaw. It might be a shallow breathing pattern. It might even feel like dread, like low-grade dread. What does it look like in our relationships? So we talked about our body. In relationships, it can look like intimacy that never just quite gets there because one or both people aren't fully present. Okay, that's one thing I can say about my friendship with Ashley. One of the things that we practice together is safety in our relationship. And so we both feel like we actually know the other person because we were just on a trip and we were talking about what is going on in our inner worlds half the time. Okay. And so this is part of intimacy. It's safety built in the context of relationship. Okay. It might be repeating the same arguments across years without resolution. Many of you who are married probably feel this. We argue about the same things over and over and over. Okay. Another might be a pattern of giving more than you receive in relationships and staying anyway, right? These are relationships that might not benefit you, but you're staying because connection is better than nothing. At least that's what we tell ourselves. And then loneliness inside relationships. I hear this all the time. People who are married who feel lonelier in their marriage than they would if they weren't married. Okay. This is one of the hardest kinds of loneliness. We can also feel attracted to dynamics that feel familiar. So even when these patterns feel painful, we're going to be attracted to them. Okay. Because they feel comfortable. So how about in your sense of self? Right? We talked about in our bodies, we talked about in relationships. So how about in our sense of self? You might experience difficulty knowing what you actually want, not what you should want, okay? Not what's reasonable, not what others want, but what is actually true for you. You might have this sense that you are performing rather than actually living. You might feel uncomfortable being alone. Like the quiet is too loud. You might measure your worth entirely by how well your relationships are going. Remember, this is not weakness. Every one of these costs is a logical outcome of a system doing exactly what it learned to do. The work is not self-criticism, right? We just have to update our software. So what does healing actually look like? This is where our Healing Our Core Issues model gives us something really concrete and really hopeful to work with. So recovery starts with a fundamental shift. Your worth is not relational. You're not more valuable when you're needed or helpful or agreeable. You're not less valuable when you disappoint someone or you have needs or you take up space. This is not a mindset trick, okay? It is gradual. It's embodied relearning, right? We're taking our brain and we're learning a new pathway. So in this practice, we're going to notice when our sense of worth rises and falls based on how others respond to us. That noticing is the very beginning, okay? When we think about boundaries, we're learning where you end and I begin, okay? Codependence actually blurs that line between myself and someone else. Boundaries are the honest answer to what's mine and what's yours. And that includes emotions. Other people's feelings are information for them, but they're not assignments for you. You can care about somebody else's pain without actually taking responsibility for fixing it. So what's the practice? In your next difficult conversation, ask, whose feeling is this? Whose problem is this to solve? Then we want to talk about self, or owning our own reality. Codependence often means I'm outsourcing my reality. I'm letting other people define what's true for me, what happened, and what's okay. Recovery means developing the capacity to say, this is what I think, this is what I feel, and this is what I need, even if someone disagrees with you. So even if it creates discomfort. What's the practice here? We have to start small. Notice your own opinion about something minor, like what do you want for dinner? Or what restaurant do you want to go to with a group of friends? And I want you to ask the question, what do I actually want? And we'll start there. Okay, we have to grow our tolerance for our own opinions about things. Then we want to move into self-care, right? So we're tending to ourselves as a daily practice. Codependence and self-neglect are very tightly linked. You can't attend to yourself when you're always attending to everybody else. So self-care in this model is actually not a luxury. It's not getting a manicure or a pedicure. It's a daily practice of noticing and responding to your needs. Whether they're physical, emotional, or relational, all of it counts. So what's a practice look like here? Once a day, ask yourself, what do I need right now? You don't have to act on it. Just practice knowing it. Okay? How about moderation, right? Codependence tends toward all or nothing, total self-sacrifice or total shutdown. Recovery means developing a middle range, close without losing yourself, separate without disappearing. This is a skill. It's not actually a personality trait. It develops with practice and safety. And then finally, attachment. Attachment patterns are not a destiny, okay? They're deeply grooved into our system, but they're not where we have to stay. But healing does happen in relationship, which is the challenge and the point. Secure attachment can be learned with a therapist, a safe friend, a trustworthy partner, or even a community. Every time you stay present in closeness that used to make you flee, you're building something new. Every time you speak your truth and the relationship holds, you're updating the system. You don't have to become someone new. You have to become more yourself. And that's always available to you. So before we close today, I've got a few questions for you to sit with this week. Not homework, just honest invitations. Think about a pattern you recognized most in part 1. Can you trace it back? What was it protecting you from? What did it help you survive? What did your family of origin teach you about needs? Were they welcomed, ignored, shamed, or even used against you? How does that show up today? Is there even one relationship in your life where you could practice being a little more honest? Not all at once, just one honest moment. And what would it feel like to let someone see a need you usually hide? Not to burden them, just to be known. I have a little example of this. I was walking just the other day and I had a handful of stuff. My arm was getting the circulation cut off from it. And I was walking with Ashley into a store and I said, hey, can you just grab this thing out of my hand? And as the words flew out of my mouth, I realized, oh my gosh, I am asking for help, which is crazy. And Ashley looked at me and she goes, I am so proud of you. You actually did it. So even me, who's been a therapist for years, okay, we're still learning. We're still adapting. We're still trying to unwire things that have been so ingrained in us since childhood, which is a long, long time. Okay. So that's my encouragement for you. Keep going, keep trying. Codependence is the natural result of being a social creature, and we're shaped by an imperfect world. Most of us learned somewhere that being ourselves fully was too risky. And most of us are still making decisions in some relationships from that old learning. Healing is not about fixing yourself because you're not broken. It's about getting really curious about the patterns, understanding where they come from, and asking, does this still serve me? You were designed for real connection, not managed connection, not performed connection, not connection that costs you yourself. That kind of connection starts with knowing who you are. And the good news is that work is always available right here, right now, wherever you're starting from. Thank you so much for being here with me this week. If you like this episode and you want to subscribe, go ahead and do that today. But I look forward to being with you next time on Encountering You.